Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping right in today because the situation demands it. There's currently a very, very fragile 48-hour ceasefire holding between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Holding just barely, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. And this isn't just, another minor border clash. The sources we're looking at describe this as the most serious military confrontation between them since the Taliban takeover back in 2021.
That's right. It started early October 2025. Pakistan was carrying out these targeted strikes against militant groups, the TTP specifically, but it blew up very quickly.
Blew up is right. We saw artillery, drone strikes going deep into Afghanistan, ground troops clashing. Places like Kunar, Kuram, Chaman were hot spots.
So now we have this pause, this truce. But the real question, and this is for you, the learner, isn't just about will the ceasefire hold. It's deeper. It's about why this border seems perpetually cursed. Why does this conflict feel like it's trapped in some kind of, historical loop?
And that historical loop is precisely our mission today. You've sent us a wealth of material, sources that cover not just the minute-by-minute of this current crisis, but also dig into the 130-year-old root cause, the Durand Line.
Exactly, drawn in 1893.
So we're zooming out today, way beyond the immediate headlines. We need to understand how a line drawn on a map by a British diplomat over a century ago during all that great game maneuvering.
Right, Britain versus Russia.
How that line is still literally fueling artillery barrages and drone strikes in the 21st century.
And the sources we have cover a lot of ground. The timeline of this specific October flare-up, obviously, but also the real asymmetry in military power here. Pakistan's tech versus the Taliban's ground game.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that.
Plus the ripple effects, China's watching its investments nervously, India's strategic calculations. It's a whole regional chessboard.
And crucially, the wider context. This isn't just about the Durand Line, is it? It's about the whole legacy of colonial map-making. Radcliffe Line, McMahon Line. These arbitrary borders causing chaos for decades, even centuries.
The global pattern, really.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because this is a situation where the past isn't just, dead buried in history books. It's alive. It's actively directing fire. We literally need to go back to the drawing board, the original colonial drawing board, to figure out why this particular wound just won't heal.
Right. So where do we start? The immediate spark for this round of fighting, October 2025.
Yeah, the trigger.
Well, the sources are pretty much in agreement here. The immediate cause, the thing that really pushed it over the edge, was Pakistan's campaign against the Taliban Pakistan.
The TTP.
The TTP. And this is where it gets incredibly complicated, almost painfully ironic for Pakistan, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. There's a profound security paradox here. For years, decades even, Islamabad had this, let's call it a strategic relationship with the Afghan Taliban. They saw them as strategic depth, right? That was the term. A buffer.
Exactly. A buffer against India, against Western influence, whatever the perceived threat was at the time.
Yeah.
But that whole strategy just imploded after the Afghan Taliban took Kabul in 2021.
Why? What changed so drastically?
Well, the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, the PTP, they're not the same entity, but they're deeply intertwined, ideologically, personnel-wise. They fought side by side against the U.S. and NATO for 20 years.
Kind of brothers in arms during the insurgency?
Precisely. So when the Afghan Taliban won in Afghanistan, the TTP didn't just pack up and go home. They turned their guns back towards their original target, the Pakistani state.
Viewing Islamabad as, what, un-Islamic?
Essentially, yes. An occupier Pashtun lands, an illegitimate state. And the violence they unleashed in 2025 alone, according to the sources, was devastating for Pakistan.
Yeah, the numbers are stark. Hundreds of Pakistani soldiers and civilians killed just in that year. Bombings, ambushes, assassinations.
A massive internal security crisis. And Pakistan's core accusation became the Afghan Taliban government in Kabul is sheltering these TTP fighters, giving them safe haven, letting them operate freely across that porous border.
Which Kabul denies, of course.
Naturally. Kabul says Pakistan is just looking for a scapegoat, trying to blame Afghanistan for its own inability to control the militancy within its own borders. Classic blame game.
So that's the immediate friction point. Pakistan feels it has to strike across the border to stop the TTP attacks.
But every single cross-border strike, whether it's artillery or a drone, is seen by Kabul as a fundamental violation of Afghan sovereignty. an act of aggression.
And that's the tinderbox that ignited in early October. Let's walk through that timeline because the sources show it escalated incredibly fast.
It really did. October 2nd, October 3rd. That's when the first serious clashes erupted. We're talking the border areas.
Yeah.
Kunar and Nuristan provinces on the Afghan side.
Spilling over into Pakistan's Chitral region too, right?
Right. The fighting was intense enough that initial reports mentioned at least 3 Pakistani soldiers killed straight away. And immediately, the accusation started flying. Pakistan says TTP fighters were being sheltered and launching attacks from there. Kabul says Pakistan launched unannounced air raids first.
Tit for tat right from the start.
And just ramped up from there. Things got quiet for a few days, maybe some localized shelling, but then came October 9th. That seems to be a key turning point.
What happened then?
Pakistan apparently decided to escalate significantly. The sources describe widespread airstrikes, using drones, maybe jets, hitting targets deep inside Afghanistan.
Not just border skirmishes anymore.
No. We're talking alleged TTP safe houses being targeted in major populated areas. Kabul itself, Khost, Paktika, these were strikes designed to send a very strong message. Highly visible.
And highly risky hitting populated areas like that.
Extremely risky. And the sources confirm there were significant civilian casualties. The numbers are disputed, of course, always are in these situations, but initial reports mentioned dozens of non-combatants killed.
Which would inevitably draw international condemnation.
Instantly. Sharp condemnation from human rights groups, worried statements from regional powers, and crucially, it seemed to really galvanize the Afghan Taliban. It gave them the justification in their eyes to retaliate forcefully.
So how did Kabul hit back? They don't have an air force to match Pakistan's.
No, they don't. Their strength is on the ground. So between October 9th and, say, October 12th, the Taliban launched heavy, coordinated ground assaults on Pakistani border posts. They used their experienced fighters, guys who know that mountain terrain like the back of their hand.
Veterans of the anti-NATO insurgency.
Exactly. And this is where it gets interesting, militarily. Several independent reports, cited in the materials you sent, suggest they actually succeeded in overrunning multiple Pakistani outposts.
Really? Overrunning them?
Yes, particularly in the Chamas-bin-Boldak area, which is a major crossing point, and also in the Kuram sector. There were videos circulating online allegedly showing Taliban fighters inside captured Pakistani positions, raising Afghan flags, even TTP flags alongside them.
Wow. That's huge, psychologically, even if only temporary.
Huge psychological impact. It directly challenges the narrative of Pakistani military dominance on the border. It embarrasses Islamabad and boosts Taliban morale.
Okay, so the Taliban scores some tactical successes on the ground. Pakistan must have reacted strongly to that.
They did. It seems that tactical success pushed Pakistan toward even more forceful measures, leading into those final chaotic days before the ceasefire was announced.
October 14th and 15th.
That's right. New clashes flared up in different sectors, Khyber, near the famous pass, and also Zozai Maidan. And this time, the sources detail Pakistani tanks actually crossing several miles into Afghan territory.
Tanks crossing the border, that's a major escalation.
A very aggressive move, clearly intended to signal Islamabad's resolve, to show they wouldn't tolerate their posts being overrun. At the same time, Pakistani drones were reportedly still active, conducting surveillance near Kabul.
And more civilian casualties resulted.
Tragically, yes. At least 15 more Afghan civilians were reported killed in that final surge of fighting. There were also reports of people being forced to flee their homes in southern Helmand province due to the clashes.
And then came the ceasefire announcement on October 15th, a 48-hour truce.
Yes, almost immediately after that final burst of heavy fighting. But, and this is a crucial point the sources emphasize, this truce was incredibly fragile right from the outset.
How so?
Because sporadic shelling and small arms fire were still being reported even after both sides had officially announced the ceasefire.
What does that tell us? Lack of control.
It signals a massive command and control challenge, especially in that kind of terrain. It suggests that neither the central government in Islamabad nor the Taliban leadership in Kabul has full, real-time operational control over all their commanders on the front lines.
So local commanders might just keep firing based on their own tactical situation, regardless of orders from the top.
It certainly looks that way. These guys are operating in rugged, remote areas, communications can be difficult, and old habits die hard. It makes the whole situation incredibly volatile and unpredictable. The ceasefire could collapse at any moment, due to an incident sparked by a local unit.
It really underscores that this isn't a conventional war, is it? Like two organized armies facing off across a clear line.
Absolutely not. It's much messier. The sources frame it perfectly as a gray zone conflict.
Gray zone. What exactly does that entail?
It means it's this murky space between declared war and actual peace. It's often undeclared, low intensity but persistent. You have state forces clashing, but also non-state actors like the TTP deeply involved. Plausible deniability is often used.
And the ideological overlap is key here, right? The Afghan Taliban providing at least passive support or sanctuary to the TTP.
That's the core dynamic. Even if Kabul isn't actively directing TTP attacks, just allowing them sanctuary turns Afghanistan into a platform for attacks against Pakistan. For Islamabad, this isn't just a border dispute anymore. It's an existential internal security crisis bleeding across the border.
So Pakistan is forced to spend huge amounts of money and military effort fighting an enemy.
An enemy supported, or at least tolerated, by a neighbor. A neighbor that might be weaker militarily in conventional terms, but holds immense ideological sway and geographical advantage because of that border. It's a strategy designed to keep Pakistan constantly off balance, bleeding resources, and politically frustrated.
Okay, so that's the immediate fire, the spark. But if this fire keeps reigniting, we need to look at the fuel. And that takes us back, way back to the Durand Line itself.
Back to 1893. The deep root of all this.
Describe this line for us. 1,640 miles, the sources say.
Roughly, yeah. It's one of the most contested and frankly one of the most geographically illogical borders on the planet. It slices right through the heartland of the Pashtun people.
The largest tribal society in the world.
Exactly. And it runs through some of the most challenging terrain imaginable. The Hindu Kush Mountains, the Spingar Range, the Karakorams, just incredibly rugged.
And its origins lie in the Great Game. Sounds like something out of Kipling.
It basically is. It was born directly out of that intense 19th century imperial rivalry between the British Empire, controlling India, and Tsarist Russia, pushing southwards into Central Asia.
And Afghanistan was caught in the middle?
Afghanistan was the key buffer state. For the British Raj in India, controlling Afghanistan, or at least controlling its foreign policy and borders, was absolutely paramount. It was seen as the essential barrier protecting the jewel in the crown, India, from any potential Russian invasion or influence.
So the Durand Line was essentially Britain drawing a line in the sand, or rather, in the mountains, to keep Russia out.
That's a big part of it. It was about defining spheres of influence. The agreement itself was finalized in Kabul, November 12, 1893. The key players were Sir Mortimer Durand, the Foreign Secretary of British India.
Hence the name, Durand Line.
Precisely. And on the other side, the Afghan ruler, Emir Abdurrahman Khan. Now, he was a powerful ruler within Afghanistan, but dealing with the British Empire, he was under immense pressure.
And the agreement itself, the sources describe it as remarkably short, just 7 articles.
Terse is the word used, very brief, which tells you something. It wasn't intended as a detailed, comprehensive treaty settling all future issues. It was a pragmatic, almost hurried agreement to define who controlled what, right then and there. Stop the squabbling over influence in the border regions.
Okay, so what were the key points in those 7 articles? What did each side get or give up?
Well, Afghanistan had to formally agree not to interfere in territories beyond the line, towards British India. That was crucial for the British. In return, the emir did get confirmation of his control over some areas, like Asmar and parts of Kunar.
But he lost territory too, didn't he? Significant Pashtun areas.
He lost huge, strategically vital areas populated predominantly by Pashtuns. Waziristan is the most famous example, but also regions like Chaga. These areas were formally ceded to British India, and today they form a major part of Pakistan's western provinces, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan.
So the line literally cut through Pashtun tribal territories.
Exactly. It divided tribes, clans, even families. And there was a financial component too, which is important.
Right. The sources mention arms imports and a subsidy.
Yes. Yeah. To sort of sweeten the deal, or perhaps more accurately, to increase the emir's dependence on Britain. Afghanistan was granted permission to import weapons through British India, essential for the emir to maintain control internally. And his annual subsidy from the British was significantly increased, from 1.2 million rupees to 1.8 million rupees.
Which leads directly to the Afghan argument about why the line isn't valid, right?
Yeah.
The duress argument.
Precisely. This has been the consistent position of every Afghan government since 1947, monarchy, communist republicans, and now the Taliban again. They all argue Emir Abdurrahman Khan signed that 1893 agreement under extreme duress.
What kind of duress? Military threat.
A combination of factors. Intense diplomatic pressure from the British, the implied threat of British military power, plus the emir was also dealing with internal rebellions at the time. He was negotiating from a position of significant weakness.
So the Afghan view is that he was forced into it.
Yes, and crucially, they argue he never intended it to be a permanent international border dividing nations. His understanding, they claim, was that it was a temporary demarcation line defining operational limits for spheres of influence between his administration and the British Raj, not a final border slicing his kingdom and people in half forever.
But the British saw it differently.
The British immediately treated it as a fixed, permanent imperial frontier.
Right.
They codified it, mapped it, administered up to it. And that fundamental disagreement sets the stage for the explosion in 1947.
Partition. India and Pakistan are created. Pakistan inherits the British side of the Durand Line.
Correct. And this is where a fundamental clash occurs between international legal principles and ethno-nationalist aspirations.
Okay, break that down. What's the legal principle Pakistan relies on?
Pakistan, and indeed most of the international community, including the UK, the US, and the UN, bases its claim on the principle of uti possidetis juris.
Uti possidetis juris, Latin. What does it mean?
Roughly, it means as you possess, so may you possess. It's a doctrine in international law which holds that newly independent states should inherit the administrative boundaries they held just before independence.
Even if those boundaries were drawn by colonial powers and don't make much sense.
Even then. The rationale, whether you agree with it or not, is stability. The thinking is that if every new nation tried to redraw its borders based on ethnicity, history, or religion, it would lead to endless conflict and chaos. We saw this principle applied widely across Africa and Latin America after decolonization. So, under uti possidetis juris, Pakistan legally inherited the Durand Line boundary from British India.
And that's why most countries recognize it as the official border.
That's the legal basis for international recognition, yes. The U.S. State Department explicitly reaffirmed this position as recently as 2004.
But Afghanistan rejects this principle entirely in this context.
Completely and consistently. From day one of Pakistan's existence, the Afghan monarchy officially declared the 1893 agreement void in 1949.
Was there a specific trigger for that 1949 declaration?
Yes, the sources mention a Pakistani retaliatory airstrike on an Afghan village called Mogulgai around that time. This incident apparently galvanized Afghan public opinion against the line and gave the government the backing to formally repudiate the treaty.
And their rejection isn't just legalistic, it's based on ethnicity, culture.
It's fundamentally about Pashtun identity. Their argument is that the Durand Line artificially divided the Pashtun people. This leads directly to the demand or the idea of Pashtunistan.
Pashtunistan. That's a term we hear a lot. What does it actually mean in practice? Is it a call for Afghanistan to annex Pakistani territory?
It's varied over time, but the core idea is the creation of a sovereign homeland for the Pashtun people, uniting those living on both sides of the Durand Line. In its most ambitious forms, historical proponents suggested Pashtunistan could stretch eastwards all the way to the Indus River.
Which would mean carving off huge parts of modern Pakistan.
Exactly. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, parts of Balochistan. It's a direct challenge to Pakistan's territorial integrity, based on the assertion that the shared Pashtun culture, language, and kinship ties are more legitimate, more real than a border drawn by British imperialists. For many Pashtuns, particularly on the Afghan side, but also some in Pakistan, the Durand Line remains a foreign imposition, a scar.
Which brings us right up to the present day, and the physical embodiment of this conflict, the fence.
Ah, yes, the fence, the multi-million-dollar border fence Pakistan has been building.
Over 98% complete by 2023, the sources say, costing over $500 million.
A massive undertaking. From Pakistan's perspective, it's an absolute security necessity. It's meant to stop the TTP infiltrating, cut down on smuggling, control movement, basically assert sovereignty over a border they see as legally theirs, but practically very porous and hostile.
But how is it viewed from the Afghan side by the Taliban government?
They hate it. They see it as the ultimate symbol of Pakistani aggression and an attempt to permanently solidify that colonial division. They view the fence itself as a violation of Afghan sovereignty and an attack on the unity of the Pashtun nation.
So the fence isn't just wire and concrete, it's politically charged.
Highly charged. It's constantly debated online. Afghans call it the scar of empire. Pakistanis often refer to it as a shield of sovereignty, or essential for security. The fence perfectly encapsulates the clash, internationally recognized border versus ethno-national identity, law versus belonging.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly and look at the actual fighting in October 2025. The sources talk a lot about the asymmetry of the forces involved.
Yes, it's a classic case study in modern asymmetrical warfare. You have two very different kinds of military power facing off.
On one side, Pakistan. What are their strengths?
Technology, primarily. Pakistan has a modern professional military with significant air power. We're talking F-16 fighter jets, sophisticated armed and surveillance drones, precision-guided munitions, electronic warfare capabilities, the works.
Allowing them to do what?
Allowing them to conduct those deep strikes we talked about earlier, hitting alleged TTP targets far from the border, gathering intelligence, controlling the airspace. They justify these actions as necessary defensive measures against terrorism.
Okay, that's Pakistan's edge. What about the Afghan side, the Taliban forces? They obviously can't match that technologically.
Not even close. They have effectively no functional air force, limited heavy artillery, and rely mostly on equipment captured from the former Afghan army or older systems. Their strengths lies elsewhere.
Where?
In their people and their experience. First, ideological commitment. These fighters believe strongly in their cause, whether it's defending Afghan sovereignty or supporting their TTP brethren. Second, terrain familiarity. They know those mountains intimately. Third, tactics. They are masters of guerrilla warfare, honed over 20 years fighting the most powerful military alliance in history.
So ambushes, IEDs, using the mountains for cover.
Exactly. Infantry-based tactics, exploiting Pakistan's reliance on roads and fixed positions, using surprise and local knowledge. High morale, deep experience in irregular combat, that's their advantage.
But despite Pakistan's tech advantage, we mentioned earlier that the sources report some significant setbacks for them on the ground in October.
Yes, and this is a really crucial point that often gets lost in the focus on air power. The reports of several Pakistani border outposts being overrun, particularly in Kurram and Shaman, around October 11-12. That's significant.
Why is it so significant?
Because it shows the limits of technology against determined, well-adapted ground forces in complex terrain. It also has a huge psychological impact. Pakistan is spending vast sums on high-tech defenses, yet relatively lightly armed Taliban fighters could still breach them.
And the Taliban capitalized on this, you said. Propaganda.
Absolutely. Those videos circulating online, allegedly showing Taliban fighters celebrating inside captured Pakistani posts, raising flags, that's pure psychological warfare. It's aimed at damaging the morale of Pakistani troops who, remember, may have complex feelings, fighting groups they once saw as allies or strategic assets, and projecting an image of Taliban strength and Pashtun defiance.
It fuels the narrative that Pakistan can't control its own border.
Precisely. Now, we need to be careful here. Some narratives emerged online, particularly during the fighting, suggesting the Afghan Taliban might even try to seize territory inside Pakistan, like in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province.
Right, I wanted to ask about that. The sources seem to dismiss this idea.
Correct. The sources we reviewed are quite clear that this is highly implausible. While the Taliban can achieve tactical successes at the border and support the TTP inside Pakistan, the idea of them launching a full-scale invasion to capture KP is unrealistic.
Why?
Simple, overwhelming military superiority. Pakistan is a nuclear power with a large, well-equipped, integrated military. Afghanistan's economy is shattered, they lack air power, heavy armor is limited. Any attempt at a conventional invasion would invite a devastating, potentially catastrophic response from Pakistan. They simply cannot match Pakistan's conventional military might.
So the real threat isn't invasion, but that persistent destabilizing gray zone activity.
Exactly. The Afghan Taliban doesn't need to invade KP to achieve its strategic goals. All they need to do is continue providing that sanctuary, that operational space for the TTP. That keeps the pressure on Islamabad, forces Pakistan to divert huge resources to border security and counterterrorism, strains Pakistan's internal cohesion, and allows the Taliban to play the Pashtun nationalist card. It's indirect warfare, and it's very effective for them. Okay, this conflict obviously isn't happening in a vacuum. Let's widen the lens to the regional players. How does this Pakistan-Afghanistan fighting affect the big neighbors? China, for instance. China's watching this very closely and with considerable concern. Their flagship Belt and Road project, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC.
Billions and billions of dollars invested?
Over $60 billion, yeah. And CPEC's viability depends heavily on stability and security in Pakistan, particularly in those western provinces bordering Afghanistan, Balochistan, and KP. Key roads, pipelines, and ultimately the link to the strategic water port run through or near these areas.
So fighting near Kurram or Chaman directly threatens CPEC
Yeah.
routes.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Any instability, any spillover of conflict is a direct threat to China's massive investment and its long-term geostrategic plans for the region.
Yeah.
So Beijing's position is clear. They were urging de-escalation, putting pressure on their ally Pakistan to stabilize that border fast, protect the investment.
And then there's India, Pakistan's arch rival. It's their angle here. Islamabad often accuses them of meddling.
Yes, that accusation is a constant refrain from Islamabad, that New Delhi is secretly aiding the Afghan Taliban, providing intelligence or funds, specifically to destabilize Pakistan's western flank.
Does India admit to this?
No, India categorically denies these claims. They usually portray them as Pakistan trying to externalize blame for its own internal problems with the TTP. We have to report these as claims and counterclaims.
But strategically, does India benefit from Pakistan being tied down on its Afghan border?
Well, from a purely realpolitik perspective, Indian strategists would certainly observe that a Pakistan heavily preoccupied with security challenges on its western border potentially has fewer resources and less attention to focus on its eastern border with India, particularly in the context of Kashmir. It potentially reduces pressure on India.
So whether they're actively involved or not, the conflict serves a certain strategic interest for New Delhi.
That's the strategic calculus, yes. It weakens their rivals' overall posture.
What about other players, the U.S., Russia, Gulf states?
Well, the Gulf states, particularly Qatar and Saudi Arabia, stepped up quickly offering mediation. They both maintain significant influence and financial ties with the Taliban leadership from years of diplomacy and aid. They see themselves as potential brokers.
And the U.S., given their history in Afghanistan.
The U.S. position has been cautious, calls for restraint, emphasizing the need for stability, especially given Pakistan's nuclear status. They're wary of getting drawn back into Afghan complexities and are likely coordinating quietly with regional partners, but avoiding taking sides publicly.
Then Russia and Iran.
They tend to view these clashes through their own geopolitical lens. Both are concerned about instability and potential militant spillover from Afghanistan into Central Asia or towards Iran. But they also frame the conflict as further evidence of the failure of the U.S.-NATO intervention and withdrawal, arguing it left behind unresolved problems and security vacuums.
So everyone's watching, everyone has a stake, but the core issue remains that border.
That border and the history it represents, which brings us to the really big picture here.
Right, because the Durand Line, as problematic as it is, isn't unique, is it? The sources frame it as just one example of a much larger phenomenon.
Exactly. It's a symptom of what the analysis calls cartographic colonialism, or even cartographic violence.
Cartographic violence, that's a strong term. What does it mean?
It means that the act of colonial mapmaking wasn't just about charting territory. It was an act of power, an imposition of control, often done with profound ignorance or deliberate disregard for the existing human geography, the cultures, ethnicities, economies, and political structures already on the ground.
It wasn't about accurately representing reality, but about creating a new reality convenient for the colonizer.
Precisely. Lines were drawn on maps in European capitals, often based on incomplete information or strategic convenience, that sliced through coherent societies, lumped rival groups together, or separated communities with shared histories. The goal was often divide and rule.
But the long-term result, as one source puts it, was more like divide and ruin.
Sadly, yes. These artificial lines became the borders of post-colonial states, baking instability and conflict into their very foundations. And the sources give some powerful, tragic examples beyond the Durand Line.
The most obvious, perhaps the most catastrophic, being the partition of India in 1947.
Absolutely. The most devastating example in terms of immediate human cost. The task of drawing the border between India and the newly created Pakistan fell to a British lawyer, Sir Cyril Radcliffe.
And the key, almost unbelievable fact the sources highlight.
He had never been to India before he was given this monumental, fate-deciding task. He had minimal knowledge of Indian geography, society, or the complex distribution of religious communities.
How could that even happen?
It was rushed. The entire process was done against an impossibly tight deadline set by the departing British. Radcliffe used outdated maps, flawed census data, and drew the lines the Radcliffe Line largely in secret.
And the consequences when that line was finally revealed after independence?
Utter chaos and horrific violence. The line ran through villages, divided communities, cut across irrigation systems, sometimes even went through houses. Because people didn't know where the border would be until the last minute, it triggered panicked mass migrations in both directions. Hindus and Sikhs moving to India, Muslims moving to Pakistan.
Leading to the displacement of, what was the figure?
Around 15 million people displaced, the largest migration in human history. And in the communal frenzy and violence that erupted along the way, estimates suggest over 1 million people were killed, all a direct consequence of that arbitrarily drawn line.
1 million dead.
Yeah.
It's staggering. Are there other, maybe less known but still damaging examples?
Yes, the sources mention the quieter, more gradual cultural partitioning of Mithila.
Where's that?
It's an ancient cultural region, historically spanning parts of what is now northern Bihar in India and the Terai Plains of Nepal. It had a distinct language, Mithili, philosophy, art forms, a shared identity. But the colonial border drawn between British India and Nepal cut right through it.
So not necessarily violent conflict, but a slow erosion.
Exactly. Over time, that political border became a barrier to cultural exchange. Pilgrimage routes were disrupted. The shared language faced pressure from Hindi and Nepali, respectively, and the unified cultural zone slowly fragmented. A quieter tragedy, but still a result of the mapmaker's pen ignoring cultural reality.
And even high mountain ranges weren't spared this arbitrary line drawing. The India-China border.
The McMahon Line, another classic example, drawn during the 1914 Simla Convention, primarily by British officials trying to define the border between Tibet and British India.
Again, drawn by outsiders.
Largely, yes, without full agreement from all parties. China never ratified it. And based on British strategic interests, rather than a deep understanding of the complex ethnic groups and traditional boundaries in those high Himalayan regions. And today, that McMahon Line remains a major point of contention, a flashpoint leading to border clashes and intense military buildup between nuclear-armed India and China.
So these lines drawn a century ago are still potential triggers for major wars today.
Absolutely. They have incredibly long, dangerous legacies. And perhaps nowhere is this legacy more widespread than in Africa.
The scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference.
The Berlin Conference of 1884-85 is the ultimate symbol of cartographic arrogance. European powers gathered in Berlin with no African representatives present and literally carved up the entire continent amongst themselves.
Like slices of cake is the phrase often used.
That's the image. They drew lines on maps, often straight lines, ignoring massive rivers, mountain ranges, existing kingdoms, ethnic groups, trade routes, everything. They imposed a European political geography onto Africa based purely on European competition and resource interests.
And the consequences: civil wars, instability, genocide.
The links are tragically clear in many cases. The sources trace numerous post-colonial conflicts directly back to these imposed borders. You had situations where rival ethnic groups were forced together into a single state, like in Nigeria, which contributed to the Biafran War.
Or borders dividing single ethnic groups across multiple states.
Yes, creating permanent cross-border tensions and fueling secessionist movements. Worse still, colonial powers often practiced divide and rule within these artificial states, elevating one group over others for administrative convenience.
Like the Tutsi and Hutu in Rwanda and Burundi.
That's a prime example cited. The Belgian colonial administration actually formalized and rigidified these ethnic categories, issuing identity cards and generally favoring the Tutsi minority. This created deep resentments that exploded into horrific violence and genocide decades after independence. The ongoing instability in places like Sudan and South Sudan also has deep roots in how colonial boundaries were drawn, ignoring the North-South divide.
It's a devastating global pattern, and the Durand Line fits right into it.
It's a textbook case. A line drawn for imperial convenience, dividing a people, creating resentment, and fueling conflict generations later. Understanding this broader history of cartographic violence is essential to grasping why the Durand Line conflict is so intractable.
So, if these lines are the problem and military solutions seem only to deepen the wounds, what's the way out? Is there a path forward suggested by the analysis?
Well, a core argument that comes through strongly is that in today's world, interconnected, globalized, nuclear-armed, large-scale conventional war is just, well, it's economically ruinous and morally untenable. It doesn't achieve lasting solutions.
Especially between neighbors like Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Particularly then. The sources argue that modern power isn't just about military might anymore. It's about economic influence, technological innovation, data, soft power, interconnectedness. Continuing down the path of border clashes and proxy wars only leads to mutual destruction and deeper poverty.
So, if war is the problem, what's the alternative proposed?
The most compelling alternative highlighted is leveraging economic interdependence, using trade, essentially, as a peace-building tool.
Trade as a peace process. How does that work?
The idea is simple. When economies become deeply intertwined, when businesses and people rely on cross-border commerce for their livelihoods, the cost of starting a conflict becomes incredibly high for everyone. It creates constituencies for peace on both sides.
Are there examples where this has worked, transforming enemies into partners?
Absolutely. The sources point to the classic example. France and Germany. Arch enemies for centuries, fought 3 devastating wars between 1870 and 1945. Yet through economic integration, starting with coal and steel, they became the engine of the European Union. Their economies, industries, even defense structures are now deeply linked. War between them is unthinkable.
A remarkable transformation. Any other examples?
Consider the U.S. and Vietnam. Bitter ideological enemies fought a brutal war. Now, they are major trading partners, with significant U.S. investment in Vietnam and extensive bilateral commerce. Economic interest helped overcome historical animosity.
So could this model apply to the Pakistan-Afghanistan situation despite the Durand Line issue?
The potential is definitely there. The sources recall brief periods, particularly in the early 2000s, when border crossings were open more freely for trade. Trucks carrying goods started flowing between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
And what was the effect?
Immediate, tangible economic benefits for the border communities on both sides. Towns boomed, people found jobs, there was a sense of shared prosperity. The sources mention a palpable feeling then that peace is profitable. People saw the direct benefits of open borders.
So why didn't it last? What are the obstacles?
The main obstacle is political fragility and deep mistrust. Every time there's a major political incident, a significant TTP attack inside Pakistan, a controversial statement from Kabul, a border clash, the knee-jerk reaction is to shut down the border, halt trade, and retreat into suspicion.
So the economic logic gets overridden by political events.
Exactly. The peace dividend is real, but it's fragile. The sources argue that for trade to truly work as a peace mechanism, it needs to be somewhat insulated from day-to-day politics. It needs to be driven by the needs of the people and businesses, sustained even during political tensions, not just switched on and off by governments.
That sounds like a major challenge. Given this complex reality, what possible future scenarios do the sources outline for this specific Durand Line conflict, especially after the October 2025 flare-up?
The analysis suggests 4 main possibilities, ranging from grim to hopeful. The most probable scenario, unfortunately, is seen as a prolonged low-intensity war.
Basically more of the same.
Pretty much a kind of controlled conflict. The border continues to simmer. You get periodic flare-ups like the one in October, strikes, raids, shelling followed by temporary ceasefires or de-escalation.
Yeah.
Neither side wants full-scale war, but neither is willing or able to fully resolve the underlying issues. So they manage the conflict, letting it bubble along.
Keeping the tension alive, but avoiding catastrophe. What's the next scenario?
A more optimistic one. Negotiated settlement, potentially under Chinese mediation.
Right, China.
Because China has the most direct, tangible economic leverage, primarily through CPEC. Beijing has a powerful incentive to push both sides towards a more stable arrangement to protect its investments. They could potentially broker a deal focused on enhanced security cooperation, counterterrorism coordination, and maybe even some form of border management agreement, using economic incentives as the carrot.
Like the Saudi-Iran deal China mediated.
That's the model people point to, yes. China playing the role of regional power broker, focused on economic stability.
Okay, what about the downside? What's the worst-case scenario?
The sources identify the worst case as a potential internal fracture within Pakistan.
How could that happen?
If the conflict escalates significantly or drags on it indefinitely, forcing Islamabad to pour massive resources into an unwinnable border war. Combine that with potential TTP success in exploiting Pashtun nationalism and anti-state sentiment fueled by the conflict, there's a fear it could exacerbate internal divisions within Pakistan, potentially leading to greater instability or even fragmentation. It's a nightmare scenario, but one that analysts consider when looking at prolonged asymmetric conflicts.
And the best-case scenario, the ideal outcome.
The ideal case outlined is a comprehensive regional peace initiative. This wouldn't just be Pakistan and Afghanistan talking, but involving other regional players and potentially multilateral organizations like the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
So what would that initiative focus on?
It would need to be broad, not just ceasefires, but tackling the root causes. joint counterterrorism mechanisms, serious steps towards trade normalization and economic integration, potentially investment in cross-border infrastructure, and crucially, public dialogue to address the historical grievances and propaganda on both sides. A truly holistic approach.
That sounds ambitious. Based on all this analysis, if you were to create a sort of blueprint for managing conflicts born from these colonial lines anywhere in the world, what would the key steps be?
The sources suggest a few core principles seem essential. First, normalize trade before formal talks. Don't wait for politicians to agree. Let the trucks roll first. Build economic interdependence from the ground up, creating incentives for peace that aren't dependent on political breakthroughs.
Let commerce lead the way. What else?
Second, invest in shared regional infrastructure. Things like power grids that cross borders, shared water management systems, pipelines, railways, digital networks. When countries physically rely on the same infrastructure, the cost and complexity of conflict rise dramatically. It literally wires them together.
Makes sense. What about the human element? The mistrust?
That's crucial. Third, actively build people-to-people channels. Encourage cultural exchanges, tourism, where safe, academic collaborations, joint media projects. Anything that helps humanize the enemy on the other side of the line and bypasses the often toxic official narratives. Build trust at the grassroots level.
And finally, tackling the narratives themselves.
Yes. Fourth, consciously fight propaganda. This requires governments, media, and civil society on both sides to actively counter the decades of fear-mongering, historical revisionism, and nationalist rhetoric that is used to justify conflict. Promote narratives of shared interests and coexistence. It's a long-term battle for hearts and minds.
Trucks before tanks, shared grids, human connections, and fighting propaganda. A challenging recipe.
Very challenging, but perhaps the only sustainable path away from perpetual conflict rooted in these historical scars.
So bringing this all together after our deep dive, what's the core takeaway from the October 2025 crisis and its deep roots?
I think the central paradox that emerges is this. Afghanistan, despite being militarily weaker in conventional terms and economically fragile, possesses a kind of ideological resilience. Its rejection of the Durand Line is deep-seated, tied to sovereignty and Pashtun identity. Pakistan, on the other hand, is militarily strong, a nuclear power, but politically brittle, constantly destabilized by the internal security crisis emanating from that same border.
Strong state, weak nation versus weak state, strong national idea.
Something like that. And the Durand Line remains this open wound, this battlefield, precisely because both sides seem trapped, fighting ghosts from the past. Imperial legacies, historical grievances, rather than pragmatically negotiating a functional future based on mutual needs.
So wrapping this up for you, the learner, what's the final message? What should we take away from this complex, tragic situation?
I think the ultimate lesson is that in the 21st century, genuine strength isn't just military power. It's stability, resilience, and economic integration. The colonial powers drew the lines on the map, often carelessly and cruelly. But the generations that followed are the ones who have to live with the consequences.
We have to learn to live beyond those lines.
We have to find ways to make them less relevant, less toxic. The future, the sources seem to suggest, belongs not to the nations that perpetually prepare for and fight wars over these inherited borders, but to those who find mutually beneficial ways to transcend them, to cooperate despite them, essentially, to avoid the conflicts altogether.
Building bridges, not just fences.
Exactly. And the sources really boil down the core conflict to three competing, almost irreconcilable demands. For Pakistan, the primary driver is security stopping the TTP attacks. For the Afghan government, it's sovereignty resisting perceived Pakistani interference and asserting control over their territory. And for the Pashtuns caught in the middle, it's about belonging, challenging a line that divides their homeland.
Which sets up a final, really provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. International law, as we've discussed, generally upholds the colonial border, the Durand Line, based on Udipasidatus juris. But the powerful force of cultural identity, Pashtun nationalism, rejects that line vehemently.
So the question is, in the long run, which force proves stronger? Is it the legal document, the treaty signed under duress over 130 years ago? Or is it the shared bloodline, the common language, the cultural identity that existed long before that line was ever drawn and continues to defy it? What would be the real cost and the potential benefit of finally trying to erase, or at least fundamentally redraw, the lines left behind by empire?
A profound question with no easy answers. That's certainly something to think about. Thank you for bringing these sources to us for this deep dive.